Today we're talking about power equations. What is a power equation? It's an equation which has a power of x, like x to the power of n, and then that is equal to something. So this is a power equation. It really depends on what the power is. So depending on this power, we'll have different answers. So for example, if you have x squared is equal to something, then we have seen before in the past that we have two solutions, plus or minus the root of that number. So let me give you an example here. An example would be x squared is equal to 4. So what are the two solutions here? Well, the solutions would be plus or minus the root of 4, meaning that x will be equal to plus or minus 2. Now, why is that the case? That is because of this power being even, being 2. Because think about it, positive 2 times positive 2 will give us 4. So 2 squared will give us 4. But this also happens with negative 2. Because negative 2 times negative 2 will also give us 4. So we actually have two solutions because of this power being even. Now, here you will see that we have a different case. We could have a different power, slightly bigger power. So for example, let's say we could have x to the power of 4. So if you have x to the power of 4 is equal to 16, then again, we will have two solutions. Only now we will have two solutions given by the quartic root of 16, plus or minus the quartic root or fourth root of 16. So basically, let's think about what number raised to the power of 4 will give us 16. That number is 2, because 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. So therefore, here we will have the answer plus or minus 2. Now, this business here with the plus or minus is happening because the power is 4. And that means minus 2 times minus 2 times minus 2 times minus 2 will be positive, because negative times a negative makes a positive, times a negative makes a negative, times a negative makes a positive. So notice that when you have a power which is even, so this is even, this is even, that even power means you have two solutions. So you have plus or minus. But now let's look at a case where your power is odd. So let's talk about the example of x cubed is equal to 8. So now in this case, what number multiplied by itself gives you 8? Well, that number we can write down as the cube root of 8. So the number that when you multiply by itself 3 times, or when you cube it, it gives you 8. And that would be just 2. It can't be negative 2, because negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 would be a negative number, because you would have a negative times a negative times a negative. Let me give you one more example. So let's say we have x cubed is equal to minus 27. So here, what would be the root here? Well, it would be x is equal to the cube root of negative 27. And this is where some students see this saying that they think, oh my God, I can't do this. There's a negative onto the root. But actually, you can put a negative under a root as long as the root is actually an odd root. So if it's a cubic root, a quintic root, meaning a 5 being there, I think the next one would be called a septic root, but I'm not really sure. Let's call it a 7th root. So if this number is odd, you're allowed to put a negative there. And in fact, this will be equal to minus 3, because minus 3 times minus 3 times minus 3 gives us minus 27. So notice what we've got here. An odd power means you only have one solution. Odd power means you only have one solution. So odd power, basically only one solution. Whereas the other case we saw, if you have an even power, then you have two solutions. And the textbook has done nicely, has presented this nicely here in a way which I'm sure most students will have a bit of an issue with, because it's very algebraic. So what the textbook has said here is this: if n is odd, then you have one solution. And this is the one solution you get here on the left. So we can remember that when you have x to the power of n is equal to something, then all you have to do is find the root of that something, the nth root. Whereas if n is even, then you have two roots, and it's always going to be plus or minus the root of the number given there. So here we have two solutions. Now, in order to clarify this further, I will do a couple more examples with you to help you carry on with today's work. So here, for example, use your calculator to find the solutions of x squared is equal to 6. Well, this number here is actually even. So n is 2, which is even. When we have an even power, we have two solutions, and those two solutions will be plus or minus in these power equations that we've got here. So what is that going to be equal to? Well, x is going to be equal to plus or minus the square root of 6. And that is pretty much the answer here. But if we wanted to, we could round this using the calculator. So you will need a scientific calculator for this, and you could say that it's plus or minus 2.45, as we've seen here in the textbook. So basically, this would be the exact solutions, and you could say that x is equal to plus or minus, or roughly equal to plus or minus 2.45, and this would be the rounded solution. So keep that in mind if they ever say give the exact value. So that was one example, but let's move on to a second example. So in this example, we've got x squared is equal to 13. Well, simply put, once again, we've got an even power. Even power means we have two solutions. Let me just clarify, I'm referring to the power. The power is even, so we have two solutions. So now that means that x is going to be equal to plus or minus the root of 13. Now, if you put this into the calculator, that will give you that's roughly equal to 3.61. So you can put a plus or minus 3.61. Now, that is the idea when you have something like x squared is equal to a particular value. But what happens when you have x cubed is equal to a particular value? So here, the power n is equal to 3. So this is an odd power, which means we have one solution. And how do we write it down? How do we find the solution? Well, we say that x is going to be equal to the cube root of that number we have on the other side. So cube root of 31, and then you can say, well, this is the exact value, but what is this roughly equal to? Now, your calculator should have an option for cube root, but if not, you can use an online scientific calculator. So when you do, this will give you something which is roughly equal to 3.14, a distant relative of the number pi. Pi starts as 3.14 and this carries on forever, but this one stops right here. So what have we seen so far? We've seen that in the first two cases, the power was 2, which is even, so we have two solutions, plus or minus the root, whereas here we had x cubed, which means we only have one solution, the cube root of the number on the other side. Now, let's move on to a problem which looks slightly different. So they say solve this problem. Now, at first sight, this problem doesn't look like the previous problems, but let's do this thing where we multiply both sides by the denominators. So we've got a few methods here, but the method I will recommend is just multiplying everything by the product of the denominators. So multiply everything by 2x. So we are multiplying by 2x, and we are multiplying by 2x on both sides. Now, let's see what that gives us. Well, notice how, firstly, the 2 cancels with the 2 here, and the x cancels with the x here. So what does that leave us with? Well, it leaves us with x times x on the left is equal to 5 times 2 on the right. So that is actually equal to x squared equal to 10. So it's equivalent to x squared is equal to 10, which now means we know how to do this. The power is even, is equal to 2. So now we will say x is equal to, well, plus or minus the root of the number we had on the right. So plus or minus the root of 10. And if you want to, you can put this into the calculator to see what the root of 10 is. So according to the book here, we don't really need to do that. Here we can leave it as plus or minus root 10. But if the question was asking you to round this to 3 significant figures or 2 decimal places, something else, you could use your calculator, put root 10 into it, and just give the answer that way. So this was more of a problem-solving question where you have to do a multiplication first to rewrite this problem as a different kind of equation which we can solve. Now I'm going to stop the recording here, and I'll give you some time to ask me questions and practice.